Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again. Podcast is brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network, one of many podcasts on this network, others of which are equally as good, to my knowledge. So it is Wednesday today, so that means no Hyperion. So what are you going to talk about, Keith? I was struggling with what to talk about today, so I did a little bit of research and realized/remembered that The Twilight Zone is on Netflix. Twilight Zone is kind of like a serialized TV show from, I would guess, the 50s, maybe earlier, not totally sure, but it is generally like, kind of like Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man, where it just gives like a brief short story or a short exploration of a particular science fiction trope in a way that is interesting and engaging. And the episodes are only half an hour long. So there are like a bunch of classics, quote unquote. So I have kind of gone through and curated a few different episodes that I particularly enjoy. And then I went and rewatched them, and we're going to talk about them now. So the first of those episodes is an episode called Masks. This is, I believe, the last episode of season 5, I want to say. Or it might be episode 31 of season 5. I should have had this right in front of me, but I don't have it right in front of me currently, so I do apologize. But it is a pretty interesting episode. The basic premise is that there is a gentleman, by the name of Jason, I think is his name, who is he's just a wealthy man who lives in New Orleans, or New Orleans, as I believe the locals are wont to call it. And he is on his deathbed. He has been for some time. And because of this, he has invited his family over, his family being his daughter, his granddaughter, his daughter's husband, and his grandson, in order for them to spend what is likely to be his last Mardi Gras with him. And for his last Mardi Gras, what he wants to do is just hang out inside and wear some masks with each other and just, I guess, chill would be, for lack of another word. His children seem to be pretty petulant, which is interesting. When we first meet them, we get a pretty clear sense of like what they're about, especially his daughter. His daughter walks in and starts like asking his doctor for prescriptions for some like unknown ailment that she has. She just generally seems pretty insufferable. And this old man takes no prisoners. He's pretty, I think savage is the word that the kids use these days, which is pretty funny. But he, when his family arrives and they're visiting him and he's on his deathbed, literally, he basically just rips them all a new one and talks about how, how great they all think that they are. he asks his daughter how she's doing, and she tries to put on like a brave face and say that she's fine. And then he says, you're always complaining about some ailment. You're always at death's door. And she says that that's not really a fair accusation, but it seems to me that it is, considering the first thing she did when she walked in was ask for prescriptions. Her husband is kind of like a mogul of some sorts, I guess, or a capital, like an investor or something along those lines. It seems pretty disengaged with the whole situation. And then the granddaughter, her name's Paula, which I remember because it's my aunt's name. I know, funny, weird things you remember. But the grandfather, or the main character, who I would argue is Jason, pretty much just like, it seems like they have this playful banter going on, but then you realize pretty quickly that he just like he just hates everybody who's in his family. Just sad, but it is what it is. So he rips her a new one, and she basically accuses her of being like incredibly vain and not really caring about anything important other than her looks, which is, not ideal, of course. And then the grandson is apparently like a secret serial killer who rides around in a wheelchair, which doesn't make any sense to me because he can walk. I guess he was just sitting in his grandpa's wheelchair. That's why he was in a wheelchair in that scene. I'm silly. So, yeah, he was hanging out in his grandpa's wheelchair, and his grandfather decides to ask him, are you still... Sorry, this is just very similar to a philosophic conundrum question. And when I say the question, you'll know exactly what question it is I'm referring to, but I won't say it on the podcast because it's definitely kind of R-rated. But have you stopped torturing small animals yet? Is the question that he asks. He asks, was Will Jr.? They just call him Jr. for most of the episode. And, of course, Junior says, like, oh, that was so long ago, and I'm changed now. I've just made the football team. Look at me. I am so great. And that's pretty much what all of these kids are doing. They're trying to, like, portray themselves as having been or done something interesting or meaningful with life. And so the grandpa just kind of takes it all in stride, or the father figure, Jason, takes it all in stride and just kind of like, yeah, that's cool. Hey, I know it's Mardi Gras, so I'm going to feed you guys a super good dinner and then make you put on masks and sit in a room with me until midnight. And they, of course, the majority of the family's kind of like, well, it's Mardi Gras, dude. We want to go out, but they end up staying. So the night goes on, and then eventually we get to the scene where they're all in this room, and they're, just after dinner, and they're all trying to convince Jason that they shouldn't have to wear the masks, which is just, it just seems kind of petty. Anyway. And he says, look, I know why you're all here. You're all here because I'm about to die, and as soon as I die, you're just going to get your grubby hands all over my stuff and take it, and that's why you're here. You're not here to see me. You're here to take my wealth. And he says, I get it. I understand. But if anybody doesn't want to wear the masks with me, and if anyone takes them off before midnight, then you'll lose out on your inheritance, is what he tells them. So they seem to be, they kind of like acquiesce to his request because they really want his money. But what's interesting, and this is what I thought was going to happen, I thought for sure that, because one of the masks is a skull, I thought for sure that he would put the skull mask on and like suck up all their life force and get to live like a youthful life again. I thought that was what would happen, but what actually happens is it's so much better. But he indicates to the doctor that he needs to be able to stay alive until midnight at minimum. And the doctor says, like, you are really only alive because it seems like there's something that's, like, unfinished in your life that you still feel like you need to do. And that thing that he needs to do is, like, destroy the lives of his crappy kids, which is really funny. And so when they put the masks on, they obviously do, like, a little montage, like, time skip thing so that we don't have to watch all of it. because that would be ridiculous. It would be like 3 hours. So we watched a little bit of it, and they're in like the last 10 minutes. It's like 11:50 at night, and they all start just beseeching Jason, the main character, like, can we please take the masks off? They're suffocating us. It's miserable. I can't stand it. And Jason just kind of like prolongs it and talks with them a little bit, kind of how, like why he did what he did in some capacity. But when they go to put the masks on, there's a premise that I kind of skipped over. He says that you should wear the mask that is the opposite of what you are. So if you are a beautiful person, like Paula believes herself to be, you should wear the mask that looks the ugliest. And if you are a person who is amiable and easy to get along with, then you should wear the mask that goes with that, which is the one that looks not easy to get along with and is full of greed, because you are amiable for your own means and not because you genuinely like other people. He has his daughter wear a mask that looks like a coward because she tries to pretend to be brave and like she's dealing with this constant fight of illness. And then of course, Junior gets a mask that depicts him as being kind of a dunce, even though Junior depicts himself as being like this intelligent, well-rounded young man. He gets basically the village idiot mask. And so by the end of the night, after Jason has delayed them taking their masks off until midnight, the father or the husband takes off his mask and realizes that his face now looks like the face that was on the mask. And so the masks are Jason says earlier that they're from like a voodoo shop and you can only wear them on Mardi Gras. And so the masks are kind of like this weird metaphor of like mask removers by wearing masks. Because obviously I don't know. I'm not the director or the writer of this particular episode. Which this episode was directed by a woman, I believe, which is part of the reason why I chose it. Not that that's super relevant. It's just that when I go to look at a TV show and it's serialized or has different directors, I usually try to find like things that are outside of the norm, because this one definitely doesn't feel as science fiction-y as a lot of the other ones do, but it still has that same creepy vibe to it, and the ending is impeccable. The reveal of the faces is impeccable, and the makeup's actually pretty good. The makeup work definitely impressed me. But I believe that this is kind of a commentary on the fact that like individuals go into social situations with a certain set of tools in order to make themselves appeal to certain people, and then they eventually become so engrossed in this lie that they're telling to other people in order to obtain social status that they adopt these personas themselves. And so the masks, I think, are supposed to kind of be like a metaphoric representation of a separation from that perceived self, and kind of like supposed to pull to the surface everything that is true about you. So if you really were amiable and fun to be around, or you were courageous, then like the mask wouldn't do anything to you. But because you portray yourself as being something that you're not, and now you, in turn, you believe yourself to be different than you actually are, the mask is going to reveal your true self to you. And the reason I think this is because Jason, the father figure, who is the one who owns all the house and all the money, wears the mask of death, and he dies. He's the only person who wears a mask that's honest about what or who he is. And I think that in some capacity, the fact that he's the one who gives out the masks to the other individuals, to his kids, one, what a spiteful old man, because he knew that he knew what would happen and he wanted to be alive to see it. Two, death is kind of like that. It is kind of like the revealer of all things. And so, in some capacity, the fact that Jason, the father figure, is the one who gives them the mask that reveals who they are on the inside to the world around them is a profound statement on what role it is that death has in the psyche of human beings. And I really do think that is true, that like death ultimately reveals a lot about, everything. So I find it very interesting that his face doesn't change at all, and he wears the mask of death. And so he's the only person who was true to true to some aspect of himself as a human being. He served as the person who gave out truth in the same way that death does, and he also admitted to the fact that death was coming for him. So when they take his mask off, instead of his face looking like the mask, his face just looks like his face. And the doctor kind of like confirms that this is what death looks like. So very interesting. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and then right after that, we are going to move on to another episode that features a familiar face. We'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Talking about in the at the end of the last segment right before the break, kind of finished talking about the episode of the Twilight Zone called Masks or The Masks, can't remember exactly. I meant to look up on the break what episode that was, but like I said before, it's in season 5. I want to say it's episode 21 or 31, so it's towards the end. So definitely give that one a watch. Really enjoyed that one. And felt like I had some good stuff to say. So the next episode that I wanted to talk about of the Twilight Zone has a familiar face, as I mentioned before. And that familiar face is actually William Shatner, which is awesome. He does a great job in this. Almost can't even tell that it's William Shatner, which is interesting because normally everything else that you see him in, it's just like, oh yeah, there's Will. So, or Bill. I wonder what people called him. They probably called him Bill. That was probably the thing to do. But anyway, so this next episode is called Nick of Time. And that's kind of like Nick at Night, but Nick of Time. So they use the name rather than, like I think if like you nick something, then that usually means that you've like scraped it, and I think that's spelled with a K, so I think it's intentional that they're spelling it like somebody's name. So this particular episode is about like a couple that their car has broken down in the middle of a small town. Rhymed. And now they're in the edge of the Twilight Zone, apparently. So I just have to say, I love the host of the Twilight Zone. I guess he also is the one who kind of created it, so it's kind of like his little baby, his love project, if you will. So I think he just does a really great job. You can tell that he cares about the show, and the writing is really great, just like in the dialogue that the characters have, but also like the dialogue of the host is like fun and witty and very punchy. Like we all know that, you are now in the Twilight Zone. Like we all know that one. It's kind of a classic. So this particular episode, William Shatner and his wife, car breaks down, stranded in a small town named Ridgeview, and they tell him, you need a new fuel pump, but we don't know if we have any in town. Why don't you guys hang out and we'll see what we can do for you. So they wander around town, and eventually they get to like a little diner, and they decide to go sit down. And while they're in the diner, they sit in a particular booth with a like, I guess it's like a napkin holder that doubles as like I guess you could call it like a fortune teller is what it's kind of labeled as. The all-seeing mystic, I think, is what they call it. And basically what it is that it's a machine where you put a penny in and then pull a lever, and it will dispense a slip of paper that will cryptically answer a yes or no question. And so, of course, they use the machine, and because this is the Twilight Zone, you're like, I don't think you should do that. But they do it anyway, because, it's the Twilight Zone. It's like a horror movie. You can yell at the people on the screen all you want. They ain't listening. So, regardless, so they decide to put a penny in and pull a slip out. And there's been this kind of like overall foreshadowing that William Shatner's character is waiting to find out if he got promoted at work. And they're both frustrated that the car might take a long time. And so they just kind of jokingly ask about, whether or not William Shatner should call work, or if he's going to get a promotion like he's been waiting on, because that's why he's been stressed about calling work. And so, of course, the thing says like, yeah, you're going to be good. You should call. And then through some sort of like questioning about the car, he is told by the all-seeing mystic that he and his wife shouldn't leave the diner until after 3 p.m. And it's indicated to him that if they do, something awful will happen. And so he decides that he is going to try to convince his wife to stay until after 3, even though she of course knows that he's doing this. He's not pulling the wool over anybody's eyes in this particular instance. He convinces her to stay by like buying an extra ice cream or like, just sticking around in general more than he normally would. And so they make it to like 2:50. So they're really close to 3 o'clock. And ultimately, as soon as they leave, right? They leave like 5 minutes before 3. There's a scene earlier in the episode where Shatner's character makes a joke about how his wife should pay more attention when she crosses the road or act a different way when she crosses the road because she's going to get killed. So, of course, foreshadowing alert, they go out and walk on the street, and Shatner's character decides that he's going to try to make a run across the street because he believes they can make it, even though I don't really know why they're crossing the street in such a hurry. And he and his wife almost get hit by a car that's trying to pass a semi-truck. And so that's very traumatizing for the two of them. And, of course, that just affirms the fact that Shatner's character believes that this mystic seer can actually predict the future. And so he convinces his wife, like, look, we need to go back and figure out, like, if this was true. And she's like, no, it's just a coincidence. And they have this interesting dialogue about the idea of like addiction, and they compare like alcoholism to the addiction to superstition, which I don't know if they're trying to make a commentary on modern religious beliefs at the time, but they'd be doing a good job if they were, just because a lot of religious beliefs don't stem from the doctrine that they claim to have stemmed from. They are superstitious beliefs that are perpetuated through social normalization and bad authority figures convincing individuals that this is how it's supposed to look, when really that's not what it is supposed to look like. But that's neither here nor there for the purposes of this particular discussion. So they have this discussion about, how being superstitious is ultimately as addictive as being an alcoholic. And she says, look, I get it, but like, you can't live your life like this. We can go back to the diner because I kind of want to know too, but like at some point this has got to stop. And so, there is just like, I don't know, kind of like a general consensus that this is going to stop at some point between the two of them. And so they go back to the diner, and he starts asking more questions of like, when are we going to be able to leave? Are we going to go to Ohio? Are we going to make it to New York? How long are we going to be in Ridgeview for? And so they get all these cryptic answers to all these questions, and eventually Nick just seems to be like completely, or Shatner's character, I can't remember if his name's Nick, is like completely spiraling out of control and like seeming like he's not going to be able to do or act on anything without first consulting this thing that he believes has predicted the future. And if you read the episode description online when you're like looking up lists of what it is that you should watch, like they say that it predicts the future. I'm not totally sure. They have a discussion in this episode about whether or not it's like, you know, did you fate yourself into this thing because you were so worried about something happening? Did you like confirmation bias your way into believing that this thing was going to happen, so it did happen, quote unquote? And I think that there is absolutely some truth to that. But I think that they kind of address that more towards the end of the episode. So they have a little bit of like a back and forth, which is funny because you'd think that like the owner of the restaurant would be like, oh, ha ha ha, it's these people again, and everybody wants to hang out around this machine. It's so weird, but he seems woefully ignorant of the situation at hand. I guess as long as he gets to collect the pennies out of it at the end of the day, then he's not complaining. Regardless, they ask about their car, when their car is going to be done. And the guy one of the mechanics shows up literally like 2 minutes after they ask, and, you know, will our car be done before 4:30? And it says signs point to yes. And then 2 minutes later, the guy who owns the car shop walks in and says like, hey, we found the last gas pump in town, and it's on your car now, so you're all good to go. And so they decide, kind of look at each other, and they like ultimately have to make this decision about whether or not Nick or Shatner's character is capable of leaving, because he is addicted to this idea of this thing telling him how to live his life, because he thinks that it will bring him prosperity, or that it will bring him it will bring happiness or joy. And I think that like part of the intent here is that the writer is kind of like trying to turn this thing into a little bit of a monkey's paw, but it's like a self-made monkey's paw more than the monkey's paw itself is. Because the thing about the monkey's paw in like Edgar Allan Poe is that the monkey's paw is responsible for the twisting of the wish, kind of. You're responsible for the phrasing of the wish, and the lack of specificity when it comes to that wish. But ultimately, you suffer because the monkey's paw is cursed. Whereas in this particular iteration of a similar thing, you ask a question and get an answer, and there's always a catch of like, well, was it real or not? And the end of the episode kind of plays on this idea pretty heavily, because as the camera zooms out, we see another couple come in immediately after Shatner's character comes in. And they sit down at the table and start anxiously asking questions of this mystical seer to see, like, if they are even allowed to leave Ridgeview. And that's part of, like, why Ridgeview is, like, weird, is because it has these things that keep you there. And that particular thing, in this case, is a fortune-telling napkin dispenser, which is, I think, I know it's intentional on their part that they would make the thing that predicts the future out to be so benign, because it is not like clear that it actually is capable of doing anything to us as an audience. It all seems coincidental. So it seems like you're being given as an audience member the same opportunity that Shatner is being given in the episode to decide what is real and what is not for you. And so at the end of the episode, they kind of make this statement about like how you shouldn't be living in fear of the future. And as long as you live in fear of the future, you will be unable to move forward, or in this case, to get out of Ridgeview. And so that's kind of like the message that they leave you with at the end. But I think that there's something a little bit deeper here, where it's kind of like a question of like what you give power to in like regards to whether or not it exists really, whether or not happenstantial occurrences are simply happenstantial, or whether or not they are intended in some capacity. I think that, unintentionally, this particular episode is commenting on the idea that individuals who believe that there is a point to certain things and that there is kind of like a conclusion that can be drawn, they look at the world differently than individuals who see it as more like fluid, perhaps. And so they're kind of like emphasizing that dichotomy in some ways with this particular episode, because one of the main points is like when they're talking about living in fear, it's like you can live in fear of this unknown, and like ultimately the unknown is like prevalent at all times. And so the fact that Shatner's character and his wife are able to kind of like escape the orbit of this weird thing is like a profound accomplishment in some capacity for the two of them, which, I don't know, that's part of what makes the episode good, is also that like the interactions between the husband and wife are excellently written. So that about covers it for that episode. We have 2 more episodes that we're going to talk about this particular show. So we are going to take another quick commercial break, and when we get back, we'll be talking about some more Twilight Zone.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Of the Twilight Zone. The last one that I had mentioned was In the Nick of Time, which had William Shatner in it. I believe it's from season 2. And the next one that we are going to talk about is I was just relatively surprised by it. Just generally, it kind of feels like maybe a little out of place, I guess, would be the way that I might want to phrase it. I'm not totally sure how I want to phrase this exactly. I really enjoyed this episode, but I feel like the ending kind of was like a Stephen King novel where it was like, oh, we need to explain this, and like really they didn't need to explain it at all. So it was definitely interesting, and I would recommend it. It is called 5 Characters in Search of an Exit. And it is from season 3, I think episode 14. And so it kind of posits like a very specific question, as most Twilight Zone episodes do this, where they'll kind of like pick a specific topic or thing that they're going to like hone in on or discuss long term, or for the entire episode. And it's like really exploring this particular idea. And so for this particular idea, it seems kind of like the premise is that, like, what if you were trapped somewhere alive and conscious forever, but unable to escape? I mean, that usually is what the word trapped implies, but I just kind of wanted to emphasize it. So that's kind of what the question that's being posited is, whether or not, or what would happen if that was the case. And so the episode opens on 5 individuals who are trapped in a large steel cylinder, I guess, for lack of another word. And it is a ballerina, a bagpipe player, a hobo, like an old school hobo, a clown and an army major. And I just think that there's a ton of symbolism and a lot of metaphysics in this episode. It's way more philosophy heavy, I think, than like any other episode that I've watched of the Twilight Zone, which is probably part of the reason why it stuck out to me so much. So the episode opens and we find out that the Major has just arrived in the giant metal tube prison or whatever it is that they're stuck in. So he has just arrived there and is very confused as to how he got there, does not know his name, does not remember anything about his past, and he runs into a clown, and the clown is kind of like it's like a very classic literature trope. I believe it's called like the philosopher fool or the foolish philosopher or something like that, where it's kind of like there's the smartest person among them is perceived as being the biggest fool among them because of the way that they look or the associations that other people have with things of the world, whereas like the philosopher is kind of detached from the things of the world, so their appearance isn't necessarily of paramount importance. So we meet the clown pretty quickly. And there's like a short exchange between the Major and the clown where like the clown talks to the Major and the Major seems to have some sort of knowledge about like the promotion process in the military. But that seems to be the only indication of like knowledge of a past life. And then we're pretty rapidly introduced to everybody else in the cast because the bagpipe player starts playing and then the ballerina is dancing, and like I am sure that there is like some deep-seated reference here to like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or something like that. Like it just, I don't know, it would feel kind of like on par with a lot of what Twilight Zone is about. Usually, well, at least the wackier episodes seem to be kind of about this, where it's like a very subtle nod to some sort of like other thing, I guess. But we meet the rest of the characters, and it seems like the main players really are just the Major, the clown, and the ballerina. And I think that's intentional because I think that they're supposed to represent three different types of like will or three different types of cognizance of the world. One is like a form of acceptance, one is a form of hope, and one is a form of like drive. And so the Major is drive, the ballerina is hope, and then the clown is acceptance. And so as they all interact with each other, it becomes pretty evident that like the Major really wants to escape from wherever it is that they're trapped, and none of them know where they are. They don't remember anything. They don't ever feel pain, or only thing they feel is pain. They don't feel hunger or thirst or anything like that. So it feels kind of like purgatory in some capacity. But then right before the halfway point, the Major, the military guy, actually says that it's hell. And I could kind of see that being like part of like maybe what they were trying to get at. I don't know. I feel like I might be projecting a little bit much with the interpretation that I have of the episode. But the way that I interpret this is kind of like, it's kind of like the idea of being trapped within your own mind in some capacity, or like being trapped in a state, like being trapped in a world that you have no control over. Or like, yeah. I don't know why I keep saying or like. So those portions of it are very interesting. And so they decide to try to make an escape plan of some sort. And they attempt to stack everybody up and climb out the top of this prison cell in order to escape. And then I think the plan is like once one person escapes, then they'll be able to bring them back. And it's interesting because before they do this, they propose like a variety of different scenarios that could have solicited exactly the situation that they are in. And after the first attempt, during the first attempt, the ballerina is trying to reach the top because she's the lightest, so she gets on the top of the tower of people as they're standing on each other's shoulders last, and tries to climb to the top. She cannot reach the ledge, unfortunately, so she ends up losing her balance, and everybody loses their balance, and they all fall. And what's interesting is they lose their balance because they are hearing the sound of a bell, and the bell has been a consistent sound that they've heard throughout this episode, at least at like short intervals. And that just, this whole thing feels a little bit biblical in some capacity. It feels like a little bit like a purgatory type thing. I wouldn't necessarily call it a hell, but I would say that it's not a hell also on the same hand. It's no more, or it's slightly more hellish than the world that we have now, but it seems to me that like some of the commentary that's being made here and like philosophy wise is kind of like the idea of maybe predestination is maybe in there just a little bit, as well as some other deeper, more foundational ideas of philosophy, obviously like existentialism, the desire for free will. It feels kind of like an allegory of Plato's cave in some capacity. So after the ballerina falls and strains her leg, which is absolutely representative of like something. I think there's some subtle symbolism in there, but I am not currently in a place where I can guess at what that might be. They decide to try again, and this time they make a makeshift rope and tie it around a sword, and then the major is able to get the sword over the top of the cylinder, climbs up it, and gets over the top lip, and is just sitting and observing like, wow, this is where we are, and then falls into what looks to be snow and seems to die. And then everyone's like, where did he go? What did he see? And then they're talking about how he'll come back. And this is kind of the indication to me that it felt like purgatory and not like hell necessarily, is because it seems kind of like he'll come back, but he won't have any memories. He'll be a different person. And so like it's almost like a cycle, and it's cyclical in some way of like, you know, that they go in and they come, or they go out and they come back, and they're different than they were before. But what we find out is after they zoom out from the body of the major on the ground is that he's actually a toy. Well, at least we were looking at a toy in the snow. And so a little girl picks him up and tosses him back in the bin, because it's a donation bin for orphans and toys for orphans. And then it pans over to a woman who is ringing a bell to attract individuals to come donate toys for orphans. So the twist, I guess, at the end of this episode is that ultimately it's basically just a really terrifying Toy Story. Which, I mean, like, I hope in some capacity that this episode helped to inspire Toy Story, because that would be hilarious, because this episode is actually, it's really well written to be absolutely terrifying. There is just like this profound sense of existential dread underlying every interaction that happens between all of the characters in a way that would be difficult to capture without the presence of like, almost like a silent watcher, if you will, because the bell feels like it correlates with like a specific word, or like with specific timing, or with specific behaviors. It feels like the bell rings. Like when the bell knocks them down because they're trying to get out, it feels almost like that was intentional in some capacity. And so there's like kind of this element of like a Santa Claus silent watcher type thing where it's like, yeah, you're stuck in here, but like you better be on your best behavior, because like, you know, there's consequences if you aren't. But then when that system is challenged, I think that it is definitely interesting that like, it's not really punished. it's kind of just like is what it is. So I don't know. It feels like they're just like really toying with the idea of whether or not like individuals are capable of free will, and whether or not like that free will can be broken by the correct scenario of like oppression and things like that. So we've got one more episode that I want to talk about. It's probably one that is relatively familiar to everybody. But I've just, before we talk about that, I wanted to mention Twilight Zone is just generally really, really good. And if you like Twilight Zone, I talked about a movie last week called Vast of Night, or The Vast of Night, and it's on Amazon Prime. It's included with the Prime membership. It's really good. I think it's an Amazon Prime original. It's only an hour and a half, but it's a really good solid hour and a half of a movie. So highly recommend that you guys check that one out. So we are going to take our last quick commercial break here, and then we will get right back into talking about the Twilight Zone. So we'll be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. That was our last commercial break for this particular episode. So right before the break, I had talked about the 5 people looking for an escape, or 5, I can't remember the name of the episode. I do apologize. I haven't been super great about episode titles and names. I'm running on a little bit of not enough sleep today. So, but these are all on Netflix. I want to say they have like seasons 1, 2, 3, and 5 of the Twilight Zone. And so far, as I've been watching through each of these, I've kind of like, hopscotched, I guess would be the right term, for through a few of them, just because it's been the easiest way to kind of like find ones that I really enjoyed. So the last episode that we are going to talk about today is a very famous episode. It's kind of the one that like put William Shatner on the map as far as Twilight Zone stuff is concerned. I can see why. The director of the episode is a gentleman who went on to direct a lot of like famous horror movies. So it makes sense that this particular episode is incredibly well done and also super terrifying. The basic concept is that a gentleman named Robert, who's called Bob throughout the episode, played by William Shatner, had a mental breakdown on a plane about there's no timeline, actually. I apologize. But he had a mental breakdown on a plane previously, was committed to a mental hospital, and from there he gets released, and his wife goes to pick him up, and they have to fly home. And so they get on a plane again, and he's a little worried. His wife's a little worried because, mental breakdown on an airplane. So the episode's called Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. It's the 3rd episode of season 5. It's really good. It's where the "there's somebody on the wing" line comes from. Jim Carrey makes a reference to it in Ace Ventura. I can't remember which Ace Ventura it is, but it's pretty funny. And there's a lot of like, I don't know if I'd call them allusions throughout this particular episode, but like just kind of it feels very classic American literature. but in like kind of a science fiction-y way. There's a particular short story by Flannery O'Connor called like A Good Man is Hard to Find or something like that. There's this specific line that Shatner says where he looks at his wife and asks, "Do I look crazy to you?" And he's like this well-cut, well-dressed, standard 1950s or 60s or whatever year this is supposed to be, gentleman-looking guy, you know. And so when he says, "Do I look crazy to you?" it just reminded me of that short story, because in that short story, a group of people run into a gentleman in the middle of the country, and he turns out to be like a murderer. I think he's like a serial killer even. And there's a bunch, like one of the older members of the group of people who gets killed is surprised that the guy who they meet is a killer, because she looks at him and says, like, "You don't look like a killer." So it's just been, it was interesting to kind of see that parallel between those things. So the episode starts out, they get on the plane, and the whole episode is on the plane, so it feels kind of like a single room drama, if you will, with like a limited cast. I think there's only like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 people that you see interact with Shatner, aside from the gremlin. And they take off. Everything seems fine. He's a little stressed out, but he's doing okay. And they start flying into a storm. And apparently the storm is the Twilight Zone. And when they get into the storm, he sees like this thing on the wing of the plane, and it looks like a man. And there's this really terrifying scene of when, like, you first see it and it's like slowly coming towards the window, and then it just pans back to Shatner's face, and it's just like abject terror on Shatner's part, which is like, I mean, really good acting for one, but also for two, like, just objectively terrifying for us as viewers. And he calls the stewardess over, and as soon as the stewardess gets there, the thing like flies away. Like, it just puts its arms up and then drifts back. And so Shatner's kind of like, okay, what the heck is going on here? There's something out on the wing. And it's kind of like they play it off like it's a slow descent into madness, but it's kind of like, weirdly, the director almost tricks you into taking the perspective of the people around Shatner rather than taking Shatner's perspective. Because if you were to take Shatner's perspective, where you believe that this thing is real, then it's like everyone else is crazy. And so what happens throughout the episode is that they don't really affirm to you whether he is crazy or not. So you're kind of left in this weird place of like, who's really the crazy one? Is it him or is it everybody else? And like, you're almost forced to draw the conclusion that like, he's obviously the crazy one. There's no way that anything could be out on the wing, especially not this like mythical gremlin creature. But I am watching the Twilight Zone, so it could be possible. But that's the nice thing about the Twilight Zone, is that like, the twist that's there is always like they save it for the very end. It's not quite M. Night Shyamalan-y, but it gets pretty close. The twist at the end of this one is that the gremlin is real. But I'll kind of get to that as I walk through the episode. So so Bob sees it out on the wing, calls the stewardess over twice, tells his wife about it, says that only he can see it, knows that he sounds crazy, asks his wife, "Do I look crazy?" And she says, "No, Bob, you don't look crazy." And then he says that if he could just if he asked his wife to tell the pilots or the flight engineer about it, and he says, if the flight engineer doesn't see it, I will commit myself and I'll know that I'm crazy. And of course the flight engineer doesn't see it, but Bob isn't quite convinced. So he decides that he is going to procure a gun from another passenger, which clearly this was made in the 1950s because someone's open carrying on an airplane and smoking on an airplane. Both of those things have not happened for decades, and probably rightfully so. But regardless, he sneaks over, grabs the gun, decides that he's going to open the auxiliary hatch and shoot this thing because it's tampering with the plane, and that's why part of the reason why he's started to freak out is because he's the only person who seems to be able to see this thing. Anyone else who comes around, it flies off, and it's tampering with the engine to make the plane crash, supposedly. And so he decides that he's going to open the auxiliary door and then shoot the gremlin off the wing so that he can save the flight. And that's pretty much exactly what he does. I would like for there to be a little bit more meat on the bone in this particular episode, but a lot of it is just kind of like classic storytelling tropes for horror movies, like psychological thrillers. You know, like, is it there, is it not there, is a pretty heavy theme throughout the majority of the episode. So there's just kind of this like constant sense of curiosity that is produced by the director, because the way that the camera angles are shot, it's very back and forth. And so you'll get like Shatner's face, thing on the wing, Shatner's face, thing on the wing, and then Shatner's face, and then somebody else's face is coming to like double check and see if there is in fact something out there on the wing. And it's, you know, obviously it's not there, but the way that it's framed, you can't tell that there has been something tampering with the wing until the plane lands. And it's funny. Another thing that you can kind of tell, like in these 1950s or like these older TV shows, they almost want to like assuage the stress of their audience after they know that they've freaked them the heck out, because this episode was really scary. The makeup and the costume design of the gremlin, the thing that's on the wing, is actually, it's really good. I was thoroughly impressed and really scared of it. And they've got this great soundtrack that goes over the top of it. I could really sing praises for this particular episode for a while, just because it is really well done. And it feels very like Edgar Poe-esque in the way that it's kind of like the Telltale Heart is what I'm thinking of here. It's almost got this like similar feel of like, I can see it and I know it's there and I have to do something about it, but nobody else believes me. And so I'm kind of stuck in this like weird spot of like everyone else not necessarily thinking that I'm telling the truth until I can prove it. And so like at the end of the episode, they tell us that like, hey, don't worry. He's not going to be put away forever. Here's a shot of the airplane wing with the metal panel that the gremlin was messing with torn up. And so there's evidence of tampering that is, you know, clear. So I wanted to make a couple of other recommendations as far as other episodes of The Twilight Zone are concerned. And so the first recommendation that I have is going to Season 1, Episode 22, which is called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And one thing that I've noticed throughout a lot of the seasons of The Twilight Zone is that they'll kind of blame creepy things on Russia. Because this was coming out during a little bit of that Cold War paranoia, like the very beginnings of it. I wouldn't be surprised if there were episodes on here that had like communists and things like that. So this one is focused on like Cold War paranoia, space age science fiction, and the placid surface of American life peeled back to reveal the rot beneath. So it's probably like a commentary. I'm just reading a summary here. It focuses on two residents of a quiet suburban street where mysterious power outages erupt following a flyover by an unknown aircraft. One of those two individuals is driven into a Red Scare-style panic, seeing extraterrestrial origins in the harmless quirks of all his neighbors, and the other tries to stop the witch hunt mindset from spreading. A senseless tragedy and a full-scale riot in the streets ensues, and aliens were manipulating the events on Maple Street, and then they let the good old-fashioned human nature do its dirty work for them. It's pretty good just in concept, and I think it's one of the more like famous episodes of The Twilight Zone. There's a lot of famous episodes. Twilight Zone kind of did a little bit of what Star Trek did, which was like social commentary through a much more digestible medium. And then the last one that I'm going to recommend is called The Serve Man, which is where it's season 3, episode 24. It's a seemingly benevolent alien civilization solves all of Earth's problems. Sounds great, right? Then the visitors invite the grateful public to travel back with them to their own home planet, brandishing the titular book as a combination of like a Bible and instruction manual, and a pair of cryptologists manage to decipher the name of the tome, but it's only when the former has already boarded the ship does his partner discover the truth about what's actually inside the covers. And then we get like a really dark punchline, apparently. It's pretty well remembered. And I think it's also another great piece of social commentary. That's like the great thing about these like serialized short story type science fiction shows, is that ultimately they have an opportunity to do a really good job of temporarily engaging an audience and convincing that audience to like think deeply about one specific thing in a way that's going to solicit change. And that is like, it's just not something that you get from everything else, or not everything else. It's not something that you get often from other TV shows and other like sitcoms and things like that. Just because we've talked about the idea of cognitive distance when it comes to like, I don't know, pretty much anything science fiction. We've talked about this idea before. So I think that it's important to remember that like when we go to watch stuff like this, yeah, it came out in the 50s, but there are certainly parallels between the things that they're talking about and what's going on around us today. I mean, when coronavirus first hit, one of the very first things that they were making comparisons to was Spanish influenza. So, of course, it's important to remember history, and Twilight Zone does a great job of like capturing little snippets of the zeitgeist that were present at the time. So, highly recommend watching some episodes of Twilight Zone. I haven't watched any Black Mirror, but I've heard that Black Mirror is like Twilight Zone, but now like more modern. So, definitely something to look into. That is all that I've got for you guys today. Definitely appreciate you hanging around and listening to me talk about the Twilight Zone episodes that I really loved. Let me know in the comments which episodes it is that you guys love. Definitely give us a like, hit that subscribe button, follow us, give us a 5-star review. Just give us a review, that'd be great. So make sure you guys are staying safe out there, stay well informed, and I will talk to you guys again later this week. Thanks again.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.